Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. Constitution Drive sits far away from the neat parts of town, out where streetlights stop working and the houses thin out until there are none at all. Most people don't even know the road exists unless they grow up nearby or hear about it through someone else. It doesn't show up clearly on maps, and if it does, it looks harmless, like just another back road that never bothered to get paved. In reality, it feels older than the town itself. Like it was there long before anyone decided to name it or draw lines around it. The road starts normally enough, just past the last gas station on the edge of town. The pavement cracks, then disappears completely, turning into rough dirt and loose gravel. The tires hum differently once you hit it, louder somehow, even when you're driving slow. Trees press in on both sides almost immediately, their branches leaning toward the road like they're curious about who's passing through. During the day, it feels isolated. At night, it feels watched. About a mile down the road, if you keep going, there's an old farmhouse. At least that's what people say. Not many claim to have seen it up close. And from the stories, it's a large, sagging place with peeling paint, dark windows, and land that looks abandoned but somehow maintained just enough to feel intentional. The legend tied to that house has been floating around for years, passed from older kids to younger ones, always with new details added each time. According to the story, an entire family lives out there, hidden away from the rest of the world. People say they're inbred, albino, and violent, the kind of people who don't want outsiders anywhere near their land. The warning is always the same. If you drive too close, if you get curious and step out of your car, they'll come after you. Some versions say they chase you with weapons. Others say no one who goes all the way to the house ever comes back. No one can ever name a real victim, but that never seems to matter. Because of the legend, Constitution Drive became a kind of challenge for local teenagers. On weekends, especially late at night, kids would pile into cars, light up, and drive down the road just to see how far they could go before chickening out. It was less about believing the story and more about feeling something different, something scary enough to break the boredom of a small town. Most of the time, nothing happened. They'd laugh, talk trash, turn around, and leave with a story that sounded scarier than it really was. I'd heard all of this long before I ever drove down the road myself. It was just background noise, one of those local myths you don't question too hard. I didn't believe anyone was actually living out there, let alone a murderous family waiting in the dark. Still, there was something about the road that made it hard to fully relax whenever it came up in conversation. The night we went down there, it wasn't planned as some big dare. A few friends and I were just driving around, killing time, music playing low, windows cracked. Someone brought up Constitution Drive like it was a joke, and before anyone could really think about it, we were already heading in that direction. None of us wanted to be the one to say no. As soon as the pavement ended, the mood in the car shifted. The jokes slowed down. The music got turned off without anyone saying why. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the dark, kicking up dust that hung in the air behind us. The road felt tighter than I expected, barely wide enough for two cars to pass, though it was hard to imagine anyone wanting to come the other way. On one side of the road, the ground dropped off sharply into a cliff. You couldn't see the bottom, just darkness swallowing everything beyond the edge. On the other side was a steep hill packed with dirt, rocks, and roots, eye rising almost straight up. If you went off the road in either direction, it wouldn't end well. That alone was enough to keep my hands tight on the steering wheel. We drove slowly, talking in half sentences, pointing out shadows that looked like movement until they didn't. The farther we went, the quieter it felt, like the world had narrowed down to just us and the sound of gravel under the tires. I kept waiting to see a house, a fence, anything that would signal we were getting close. But there was nothing, just road, trees, and darkness. Then someone in the back seat said they saw headlights. At first, I thought they were messing with us. People always did that on roads like this. But when I checked the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. There was another car behind us, its headlights steady and bright, close enough that there was no doubt it was following the same road. No one laughed after that. We all started talking at once, throwing out explanations that didn't fully make sense. Maybe it was another group of kids. Maybe it was someone who lived nearby. Maybe it was just coincidence. Still, none of us liked how close the car was staying, or how long it had been there without passing or backing off. I sped up a little, then slowed down just to see what would happen. The headlights matched us perfectly. That's when the fear really set in. Constitution Drive wasn't a road where you could casually pull over or make space. There were no driveways, no clearings, nowhere to stop and let someone pass even if you wanted to. The idea of reaching the farmhouse suddenly felt like the worst possible option. Whatever was behind us felt more real than any legend we joked about. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking the steering wheel. Someone suggested we turn around. Normally that wouldn't have been a big deal, but on that road it was easier said than done. The narrowness, the cliff, the hill, all of it made the idea risky. Still, staying on the road with that car behind us felt worse. I slowed down, scanning for a spot where the road widened even a little. Finally, I saw a small area where the hill pulled back, just enough. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we were going to get. I took a deep breath and started the turn, tires crunching and slipping as I carefully swung the car around. The whole time, I expected the headlights to be right there, blinding us, maybe even blocking the turn. But when we completed the turn and faced the direction we'd come from, the road behind us was empty. The headlights were gone. For a second, no one said anything. We just stared down the dark stretch of road, trying to understand what we were seeing. There was nowhere that car could have gone. No side roads, no driveways, no space wide enough to turn around that quickly. The cliff and the hill were still there, unchanged, offering no explanation. Someone finally whispered that maybe the car had turned off its lights. That idea didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. I didn't wait to discuss it further. I hit the gas and drove back toward town faster than I probably should have, not caring about the bumps or the dust. Everyone was silent now, gripping their seats, glancing back every few seconds as if the headlights might suddenly reappear. They never did. When we reached pavement again, the tension broke all at once. People started talking over each other, trying to laugh it off, but the laughter sounded forced. No one could explain what happened in a way that felt satisfying. Eventually, we dropped everyone off and went our separate ways, pretending the night was over. But it didn't really end there. Even now, thinking back on it, the memory sticks with me more than it should. Not because I believe the legend about the farmhouse or the family living there. I still don't think anyone is hiding out there, waiting to hurt people. What bothers me is the car, the headlights, the way something was clearly behind us one moment and completely gone the next, on a road that doesn't allow for easy mistakes or tricks. Constitution Drive still gets talked about from time to time. New kids discover it. New versions of the story spread around. People still drive down it looking for a scare. As far as I know, no one has ever been murdered there. No one has ever proven the legend true. But every time I pass the turnoff where the pavement ends, I think about that night. I think about how real the fear felt, how impossible the disappearance seemed. And I know that even if the stories are fake, there's something about that road that doesn't play by normal rules. Some places don't need monsters to be frightening. Sometimes, the unexplained is more than enough. The dam has always been part of our lives, even for people who pretend not to think about it. You can see it from certain high points around town. A massive wall holding back an unnatural amount of water, quiet and still on the surface, heavy with things no one really talks about unless it's late at night or someone brings up old stories. Officially, it is one of the biggest dams in the country, the second largest to be exact. I built back in the 1980s with the idea that it would supply nearby fields with water and help the region grow. That was the plan, at least. Things did not turn out the way they were supposed to. Because of various complications, political decisions, and technical failures, the dam never truly fulfilled its intended purpose. The fields were never supplied the way they were meant to be. The water stayed, the wall stayed, but the benefits people were promised never really arrived. What did arrive, however, was a massive artificial lake sitting above towns and villages, carrying with it a weight that feels both physical and emotional. Before the dam was built, there were villages where the water is now, 2 of them to be precise. People lived there for generations. They had homes, farms, roads, churches, cemeteries. When the decision was made to build the dam, the people living in those villages were forced to leave. They were relocated to nearby towns and villages, often with little choice and even less time to process what they were losing. Houses were abandoned, lives were interrupted, entire histories were simply pushed out of the way. One of those villages was called Zhivovtsi. It happens to be the birthplace of my grandmother, which makes the story feel even closer and heavier for me. She grew up there, walked those streets, knew those people. Today, Zhivovtsi no longer exists in any real sense. It sits at the bottom of the dam, drowned and forgotten by most, preserved only in memories and stories told by older generations. There is one thing, though, that still breaks the surface: the church. When the water level is low enough, parts of the church from Zhivovtsi can still be seen rising out of the dam. It is the only structure that was not completely swallowed. The roof is gone, the walls are damaged. Inside there is nothing left of what once made it a holy place. The icons are gone. Everything of value or meaning has been stripped away by time, water, and decay. Everything except one thing. On one of the remaining walls, there is a mural. It is badly eroded, faded almost beyond recognition, but you can still tell what it depicts. It is Satan. The image is distorted by water damage and age, which somehow makes it even more unsettling. It doesn't look like a clean, deliberate painting anymore. It looks like something that surfaced on its own, like it was never meant to be seen clearly, only felt. Some people believe this mural is a reminder, a symbol of the lives, stories, and memories buried beneath the water. Others think it's just an eerie coincidence, something people read too much into because humans don't like empty explanations. Either way, seeing that church, lonely and broken, surrounded by endless water, is enough to make anyone uneasy. But the church is only the beginning. The dam is also famous, or infamous, for another reason. For as long as I can remember, people have whispered about mutant catfish living in its depths. Not just big fish, monsters. Creatures so large and old that they barely feel real, like something pulled from a nightmare or an exaggerated fisherman's tale. At first, I didn't take these stories seriously. Every large body of water seems to come with legends about giant creatures hiding below. It's almost a rule. But the more you hear the stories, the more specific they get. And that's when doubt starts to creep in. There is a reason people believe something is wrong with the water. Not far from the dam, there used to be a mine. At some point, there was a chemical or industrial leak. Nothing was ever explained clearly, at least not to regular people. What is known, or at least widely believed, is that arsenic and other harmful substances contaminated the water. The dam, already artificial and stagnant in places, became a perfect environment for things to grow in ways they were never supposed to. Fish don't leave the water. They adapt. According to locals, the catfish in the dam grew larger than normal, much larger. Catfish are already strange creatures, with their long bodies whisker-like barbels and habit of lurking in dark, muddy depths. Give them contaminated water, endless space, and decades of isolation, and people start to wonder what they might turn into. One of the most disturbing stories comes from my father. He told me about a time when someone drowned in the dam. It wasn't unheard of. The water is deep, cold, and unpredictable. Visibility is terrible, and the bottom is filled with things that were never meant to be underwater. Divers were sent in to find the body. These weren't amateurs. They knew what they were doing. When they came back up, something was clearly wrong. They were pale, shaking, silent. One of them had patches of hair that had turned white, almost overnight, as people later claimed. The other had lips so pale they looked almost colorless. This wasn't just cold shock or exhaustion. This was fear. People crowded around them, asking questions, demanding to know what they saw down there. For a long time, they said nothing. When they finally spoke, all they said was that they saw enormous catfish, lurking in the deep, far larger than anything they had ever imagined. Not one, but multiple. Shapes moving slowly in the darkness, bigger than cars, longer than boats. They estimated some of them to be over 4 or 5 meters long. After that, no one pushed them for details. They refused to dive there again. Skeptics like to brush this story off as exaggeration, panic, or group hysteria. That would be easier to believe if not for what happened years later. In 2016, a local fisherman actually caught a catfish that measured around 2 meters in length. It was bigger than a human. There are photos. People saw it with their own eyes. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a story passed down secondhand. It was real. That catch didn't prove the existence of monsters, but it proved something else. The fish in that dam grow very large, larger than they should. After that incident, the stories didn't stop. If anything, they got quieter, more cautious. People stopped joking about diving there. They stopped swimming far from shore. Some hobby divers, people who explore underwater sites for fun, tried their luck once or twice. They didn't last long. According to them, the dam is one of the most terrifying places they've ever dived. Not because something attacked them, but because of what they saw. The water down there is almost completely dark. Sunlight barely reaches past a certain depth. Everything beyond that exists in a constant twilight, lit only by the beams of their flashlights. And what those lights reveal is something straight out of a nightmare. Entire patches of forest still stand underwater, trees rising from the bottom like skeletons. Abandoned machinery sits where it was left decades ago, rusted and frozen in time. The remains of houses are scattered around, walls collapsed, roofs gone, doors leading nowhere. In some areas, you can even see a graveyard, headstones tilted and half buried, names long unreadable. It's not just diving through water. It's diving through a drowned world. The divers said the silence down there feels heavy, like pressure on the chest. Every movement kicks up clouds of sediment, limiting visibility even more. Your mind starts filling in gaps, imagining shapes just beyond the reach of the light. They didn't report seeing giant catfish themselves, but they didn't need to. The environment alone was enough to make them turn back. They ended their dives early and never returned. Then there is the final fear, the one people don't like to talk about too loudly. The dam sits above the town. If something goes wrong, if the wall fails, the water won't gently spill out. It will rush down with unstoppable force. There have been reports over the years stating that the wall is not maintained as regularly as it should be. Experts have warned about cracks, unstable surrounding land, and rocks that could shift under pressure. Renovations have been discussed, delayed, forgotten, and brought up again. If the dam breaks, the town below will have little chance. The sheer volume of water would flood everything in its path. Streets, houses, schools, everything wiped out in minutes. People imagine it sometimes, usually in silence. They imagine the noise, the darkness, the confusion. They imagine the dam releasing not just water, but everything buried inside it. Trees, debris, remnants of villages, and whatever lives in the depths now. The church from Djivovci would disappear completely. The stories would finally surface, only to be erased again. Nothing has happened yet. The dam still stands. The water still looks calm from above. Fishermen still come during the day. Life goes on. But once you know what lies beneath, once you've heard the stories and seen the evidence, it's hard to look at that calm surface the same way again. Some places carry history in books and monuments. Others carry it underwater, pressed down by pressure and time, waiting quietly, hoping never to be disturbed. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. I'm not even sure if this story is supposed to count as a local legend because there's nothing supernatural about it. No ghosts, no monsters, no unexplained lights in the sky. What makes it unsettling is that it actually happened. And that it happened in a town where things like this almost never do. We don't have many murders here. That's the kind of place it is. So when something violent does happen, it doesn't fade into the background. It sticks. People remember names, faces, locations. Even years later, the story still comes up, usually spoken quietly. Like saying it out loud might bring it closer. This happened about 15 years ago, long enough that new people have moved into town and old buildings have changed owners, but not long enough for it to feel distant. I remember that time clearly. I remember where I was in my life, what I was doing, who I was hanging out with, and I remember the guy who was murdered because I actually knew him. He wasn't someone you'd expect to end up the center of a murder story. He wasn't rich, wasn't powerful, wasn't important in any official way. He was one of those people everyone in town kind of recognized but didn't really know deeply unless you crossed paths with him regularly. He had a certain look that made him stand out. Long hair that always seemed a little unkempt. Clothes that looked like they'd seen too many nights on couches and too many days slept in. He carried himself like someone who lived mostly inside his own head. People usually described him as a conspiracy hippie, and honestly, that wasn't far off. He was obsessed with theories about secret organizations and shadow governments. The Illuminati, powerful families, global control, hidden symbols, all of it. If you got him talking, he could go on forever, jumping from one idea to the next with this intense energy that was almost impressive if you didn't let it wear you down. He published his own monthly zine, which already made him kind of legendary in a small-town way. It was this chaotic mix of handwritten notes, printed articles, strange symbols, and rants typed in fonts that looked like they came from some other dimension. He didn't own a proper printer, so he'd use the printers at the local college. Apparently, he drove the computer staff insane. He was always trying to install weird fonts that didn't work on their systems, clogging up the queue, arguing with staff about why his documents weren't printing correctly. To him, it probably felt like fighting the system. To them, it was just another headache. Despite all that, he wasn't a bad guy, at least not in the way people usually mean. He was friendly, talkative, generous in his own way. I got stoned with him a few times. He always had good weed, the kind you didn't mind pitching in for. Those nights were usually pretty relaxed at first. Sitting around, smoking, listening to music, talking about nothing important. Then eventually the rants would start. He'd lean forward, eyes wide, voice speeding up, launching into long explanations about how everything was connected. Presidents, corporations, secret societies, wars, money. Sometimes it was interesting. Sometimes it was exhausting. Most of the time, I had other things on my mind. I'd nod along, half listening, waiting for a moment to change the subject or leave. Still, nothing about him screamed danger. He seemed harmless. A little unstable, maybe, but not violent. Not someone you'd imagine ending up dismembered in the woods. The part people didn't always see was that he also did coke. That brought him into contact with a different crowd. Weed is social. Coke is different. Coke introduces you to people who don't hang around for conversation. People who see opportunities instead of friendships. Through that scene, he ended up knowing some shady individuals, the kind you keep at arm's length if you're smart. At some point, he got involved in a deal. What the deal actually was has never been entirely clear to me, and honestly, it probably never will be. Drugs, money, favors, connections. It could have been any combination of those. What matters is that things went bad. The people he was dealing with were two men. One was young, barely more than a kid, reckless and not very bright. The other was older, a Russian guy with a reputation and a long criminal history back in his home country. From what came out later, they made a decision that should never have been an option. Instead of following through with the deal, instead of walking away, they decided to kill him. The actual murder didn't happen in some dramatic public place. There were no witnesses screaming, no dramatic chase through the streets. It happened quietly, out of sight, the way most real violence does. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, he was already gone. People noticed his absence before they knew the truth. He was someone who showed up around town, at the college, at certain houses, at certain spots where people gathered. When days passed and no one had seen him, questions started to come up, then weeks. Eventually the police got involved, and surprisingly, it didn't take them very long to find the people responsible. These weren't criminal masterminds. They made mistakes. They talked too much. They underestimated how closely a small town watches itself. Once the trail started, it led straight to them. The younger guy cracked first. Faced with serious time, he took a plea deal and agreed to testify against the older man. In exchange, he got a reduced sentence. The older guy, the one with the long criminal history, was convicted and received a life sentence. In that sense, justice was served, at least on paper. But that's not the part that makes this story linger. What they did after the murder is what turned it from tragic to deeply disturbing. Instead of leaving the body or trying to hide it in one place, they decided to cut it up, piece by piece. They wrapped the remains in plastic bags and buried them in different spots throughout a nearby wooded area. Not deep in some remote forest hours away, but close to town, close to where people lived, walked their dogs, took shortcuts. Eventually, the police found most of the body, digging through dirt, pulling up plastic bags, reconstructing a human life from scattered remains. It's hard to imagine the scene without feeling sick, the way something so final and violent was hidden so carelessly. But they never found everything. They never found his head. During interrogations, the killers couldn't remember where they'd buried it. Whether that was true or a lie didn't matter in the end. The fact remains that somewhere in that wooded area, there is a human head buried in the ground. Somewhere that people still walk past every day. Somewhere near a high school, of all places. Students pass through that area without knowing what's under their feet. Teachers park nearby. Parents wait in cars. Life goes on above ground, completely unaware of what's still hidden below. That's the part that creeps me out the most. Not the murder itself, not even the brutality, but the incompleteness of it. The idea that something so significant, so personal, is still missing. There was never full closure. The body was never whole. The story never fully ended. Every now and then, someone brings it up again. Usually when construction starts nearby, or when someone talks about expanding trails or building something new. People half joke about whether they'll finally find the head. The jokes never quite land. There's always an uncomfortable pause afterward. I think about him sometimes, about those nights getting stoned, listening to his wild theories, zoning out while he talked about secret worlds hidden behind the obvious one. There's an awful irony in the fact that his own end became something hidden, fragmented, and unresolved. A real mystery left behind in plain sight. 15 years isn't that long. For the people who knew him, it still feels close. For the town, it's become one of those stories that gets passed down, stripped of some details, exaggerated in others, but always rooted in something true. A reminder that even in quiet places, terrible things can happen. And that sometimes the scariest part isn't what we imagine, but what we already know is real, buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. I was around 10 years old, living in San Antonio at the time, in an apartment that never felt special or strange back then. It was just home, a normal place where my family lived, where I went to school every day, where nothing ever seemed out of place. After school, my routine was almost always the same. I would walk back, unlock the door, and wait for everyone else to come home later. On that particular day, I arrived first, like usual. I remember dropping my backpack, feeling that familiar quiet of an empty apartment, the kind that usually felt calm and peaceful. At 10 years old, being alone for a little while felt grown up. I didn't feel scared when I walked in. I locked the door behind me, just like I always did, and moved through the apartment without a second thought. For the first few minutes, everything felt completely normal. I wandered into the living room, maybe turned on the TV or thought about grabbing a snack. I don't remember exactly. What I do remember is the moment that changed everything. About 5 minutes after I had gotten home, I walked past the hallway mirror that faced toward the kitchen. I wasn't even looking directly at it at first. It was one of those moments where your eyes just catch something without meaning to. That's when I saw him. In the reflection of the mirror, standing in the kitchen, was an older man wearing a tuxedo. It wasn't vague or shadowy. It wasn't something that looked like it could be explained away easily. He looked solid, real, like someone who was actually standing there. My brain froze before my body reacted. For a split second, I honestly thought someone had broken into the apartment. Then the confusion hit, because I hadn't heard the door open. I had locked it myself. The man wasn't moving. He wasn't rushing toward me or making noise. He was just there, standing quietly in the kitchen. I dressed in a way that made no sense at all. Who breaks into an apartment wearing a tuxedo? That detail alone made my stomach drop. The fear came all at once, fast and overwhelming. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't stop to think. I didn't call out. I didn't look again to make sure. I turned and ran. I sprinted straight to my room, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip anything. I remember grabbing a baseball bat from the corner of my room. I had no idea what I was going to do with it, but holding it made me feel like I had at least some kind of protection. I backed myself into a corner near the door and just waited. I tried to slow my breathing, but it felt impossible. Every sound felt louder than normal. The hum of the apartment, the distant noise from outside, even my own breathing felt like it was echoing. I stayed in that room for about 10 minutes, maybe a little longer. At that age, 10 minutes felt like forever. I kept expecting to hear footsteps. I waited for the sound of the front door opening or closing, any sign that someone had been there and was now leaving. But there was nothing. Complete silence. No voices, no footsteps, no door. That made it worse. If someone had broken in, wouldn't I have heard them leave? The door was locked. I knew that for a fact. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to convince myself that maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes played a joke on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Eventually, I forced myself to leave my room. I held the bat tight and slowly opened the door, inch by inch, expecting something to jump out at me. I checked the hallway first, then the living room, then the kitchen. There was no one there. Nothing was out of place. No signs of a break-in. No open windows. No unlocked doors. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when I walked in. That somehow made it even more unsettling. It was like the apartment itself was pretending nothing had happened. I didn't tell anyone about it, not my parents, not my siblings, not my friends. I didn't even really think about telling anyone. Part of me was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Another part of me didn't want to say it out loud because saying it out loud would make it more real. I convinced myself it was just a strange moment and tried to forget about it. Over time, the memory faded into the background, something I rarely thought about. Life moved on. We eventually moved away. I grew older. That apartment became just another place from my childhood. Nothing more. 6 years passed. I was 16 by then, sitting with my family one night watching Ghost Hunters on TV. It was just a normal evening, nothing special. The show was on. People were talking about spirits and unexplained encounters, and we were watching casually. I wasn't even fully paying attention. Then, out of nowhere, my mom turned to me and asked a question that made my blood run cold. She asked if I remembered the old man in the tuxedo. For a second, I thought she was joking, or talking about something from the show. But the look on her face wasn't playful. It was serious, curious, almost cautious. I didn't know what to say. My heart started racing the same way it had when I was 10 years old, standing in that hallway. I had never told her. I had never told anyone. There was no way she should have known about that. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that when we lived in that apartment, she had seen an older man in a tuxedo as well. She didn't go into a lot of detail right away. It felt like we were both trying to understand what the other was saying, carefully, slowly. That's when it hit me that what I saw all those years ago wasn't just in my head. The room felt different after that conversation. The show kept playing in the background, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. My mind was stuck in the past, replaying that moment in the mirror over and over again. The fact that my mom had seen the same thing, without knowing I had, made it impossible to explain away. It wasn't a shared story. It wasn't something we talked about before. It was something that existed independently, something that connected us across time without us realizing it. Even now, thinking back on it, I can't fully explain what happened. I don't know who the man was or why he appeared the way he did. I don't know if he was tied to the apartment or to something else entirely. All I know is that the memory still feels real, clear, undeniable. And the fact that it came back into my life years later, spoken out loud by someone else, makes it one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences I've ever had. Some moments from childhood fade away completely. Others stay with you forever, waiting for the right moment to remind you that they were never imagined at all. This is my dad's story, not mine, but it has been told in our family for as long as I can remember. It happened in the early 1980s, long before I was born, when my dad was still young and spending a summer working at Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. At the time, Yellowstone wasn't just a famous national park to him. It was a place full of opportunity, adventure, and freedom. He was working a seasonal summer job surrounded by mountains, forests, wildlife, and people his age who were all there for similar reasons. The days were long, physical, and exhausting, but the kind of exhausting that feels rewarding. Nights were quiet, cold, and open in a way that city life never is. Back then, being out in nature didn't feel unusual or dangerous. It felt normal, almost grounding. One of the people my dad became close friends with that summer was a guy named Mark. They bonded quickly, like people often do when they're far from home and sharing the same routines every day. They worked together, ate together, and spent their free time exploring the park whenever they could. Hiking was something they both loved, especially the kind of hiking that took them far away from crowds and marked trails. They liked the feeling of being high up, surrounded by nothing but wind, trees, and open sky. There was a sense of peace in those moments, like the world was simpler when you were that far removed from everything else. One day, they decided to hike up to the top of one of the mountains. It wasn't a casual walk. It was a serious hike that took time, effort, and planning. They packed what they needed, including a tent, food, and basic supplies, knowing they would be staying overnight. The climb itself was tough, but they were young, strong, and motivated. By the time they reached the top, the view made everything worth it. From up there, the land stretched out endlessly in every direction. Forests, valleys, distant peaks, all blending together under the open sky. It was the kind of place that makes you feel small, but also strangely connected to everything around you. As they looked for a place to set up camp, they noticed something unusual. There was a large, man-made pit dug into the ground. It wasn't random, and it wasn't recent. My dad knew enough about the area to recognize it as what people sometimes called an Indian pit. These pits had been dug by Native Americans hundreds of years earlier. Some were used as hunting blinds, places where hunters could hide and wait for animals to pass by. Others were believed to be used by young braves during vision quests, where they would spend time alone, fasting and reflecting, searching for spiritual guidance or insight. The pit felt old, intentional, and deeply connected to the land's history. Instead of avoiding it, they decided to use it. The pit offered natural protection from the wind, and it felt sheltered compared to setting up a tent in the open. They placed their tent inside the pit, climbed in, and settled down for the night. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. The sounds of the mountain changed. The wind whispered through the trees, and distant animal noises echoed far away. It wasn't scary to them. It was just part of being out there. Eventually, both of them fell asleep. Sometime late in the night, my dad woke up with a strong need to use the bathroom. The kind that doesn't allow you to ignore it or wait until morning. Half asleep, he carefully crawled out of the tent, climbed up and out of the pit, and stood under the night sky. It was dark, but his eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes and shadows. He knew the basic rule of camping was to walk a respectable distance away from the tent, so he started moving in that direction. His mind was still foggy with sleep, and he wasn't fully alert yet. He was focused on one simple task and nothing else. As he walked, something sudden and unexpected happened. He felt a hand grab his shoulder and pull him backward. It wasn't a light touch. It wasn't something he could easily brush off. It felt firm, deliberate, and strong enough to stop his movement completely. Instinctively, my dad assumed it was his friend messing with him. Without really thinking, he called out, asking Mark what he was doing. There was no response. That alone felt strange. Mark would have laughed or said something. Still half asleep, but now alert, my dad turned around and reached for his flashlight. When he shined the light around, there was nobody there. No Mark. No figure standing behind him. No movement at all. The mountain was silent. Confused, he lowered the flashlight and pointed it toward the ground in front of him. That's when he realized just how close he had come to something terrible. Only a few more steps forward, and he would have walked directly over a steep cliff. In the darkness, he hadn't seen it. In his sleepy state, he hadn't sensed it. If he hadn't been pulled back at that exact moment, he would have fallen. The realization hit him all at once. His heart started pounding. Not from fear of the dark, but from understanding how close he had come to losing his life. He stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no one around. No explanation that made logical sense. Eventually, he finished what he had gone out there to do, but he didn't linger. He moved quickly and carefully back toward the tent, climbed back into the pit, and crawled inside. Sleep didn't come easily after that. His mind kept replaying the moment over and over again. When morning finally arrived, the sunlight changed everything. The mountain looked peaceful again, almost harmless. Birds chirped, the air felt fresh, and the cliff that had nearly ended his life was now clearly visible. It was obvious how dangerous it had been. Over breakfast, as they were waking up and packing their things, Mark said something that made my dad freeze. Mark told him that he knew it sounded crazy, but he had woken up in the middle of the night and sworn that there was an Indian man standing outside their tent. He said it matter-of-factly, not like a joke, not trying to scare anyone, just something he felt he needed to say. My dad didn't know how to respond. He hadn't told Mark about what had happened to him yet. Hearing that made everything feel heavier, more real. Two strange experiences, one night in a place with deep history and meaning. Neither of them could explain it. They didn't try to. They finished packing up and headed back down the mountain, carrying the memory with them. It wasn't something they talked about often afterward, but it stayed with my dad for the rest of his life. Whatever truly happened that night, one thing is undeniable. My dad survived. He went on to continue working that summer in Yellowstone. He met my mom there. Their lives crossed paths in that same park, surrounded by the same mountains and forests where that strange night had taken place. Years later, they had a family. Years later, I was born. Sometimes I think about how easily none of that could have happened. How one moment, one unseen hand, one step too far could have changed everything. Whether it was luck, instinct, or something far older and deeper connected to the land, my dad is alive today. And because of that, I'm here, writing this story to you now. I stayed at my grandmother's house once, a place my father had spent a large part of his childhood in. It wasn't a quick trip or a short visit. We had driven there straight through one long stretch, almost 17 hours on the road. By the time we arrived, everyone was exhausted, especially my dad. He had driven the entire way without stopping for more than quick breaks, determined to get us there in one go. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked quiet and ordinary, eyeing the kind of place that feels heavy with age, but not immediately strange. It was late, and we were all ready to collapse into bed. The sleeping arrangements were simple. My brothers and I were put into the same room for the night. It was a familiar thing when visiting family. Nothing unusual about it. The room itself wasn't small, but it felt full, like it had lived a long life before we ever stepped into it. The furniture looked old but well cared for, and there was a large mirror mounted on one of the walls. At the time, I didn't think much of it. We dropped our bags, crawled into bed, and just lay there, enjoying the feeling of finally being still after so many hours of travel. Before going to bed himself, my father came in to check on us. He stood in the doorway at first, talking quietly, making sure we were settled and comfortable. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, like the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes. As he was talking, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His gaze drifted away from us and landed on the mirror. The shift in his expression was subtle but noticeable. He hesitated, then told us we needed to cover it. He didn't laugh or explain it casually. He said it plainly and seriously, telling us that if we didn't, we would have nightmares. At that age, the idea of nightmares caused by a mirror sounded more interesting than scary to me. It almost felt like a challenge, something mysterious and kind of exciting. But my brothers didn't see it that way. They were already tired and uneasy in a new place, and the way my dad said it made them uncomfortable. They immediately asked me to cover it, so I did. I grabbed something nearby and draped it over the mirror until the glass was completely hidden. The room felt slightly different afterward, though I couldn't explain why. It was quieter somehow, even though nothing had changed. Before my dad left the room, I asked him why. I expected him to brush it off or make a joke, but he didn't. He told me that ghosts use mirrors as an entryway. He didn't elaborate or soften the statement. He said it like it was a fact, something obvious that didn't need further explanation. Then he told us good night and went to bed. I remember lying there afterward, staring at the covered shape on the wall, replaying his words in my head. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. A week passed without incident. Nothing strange happened during that time, at least nothing obvious. The mirror stayed covered. Life went on as normal. One day, I brought the whole thing up to my grandmother. I wasn't trying to accuse the house of being haunted. I said it almost jokingly, mentioning that my dad had told us to cover a mirror or we would have nightmares. My grandmother scoffed immediately. She waved it off and said that the house wasn't haunted. Her tone was firm, dismissive. Like she'd heard that kind of thing too many times to take it seriously anymore. I agreed with her. I told her I didn't think the house was haunted either. I explained that the reason I even mentioned it was because my dad had specifically told me to cover the mirror. As soon as I said that, her expression changed. It was instant and unmistakable. The dismissive look disappeared, replaced by something else, something cautious. She repeated the word mirror slowly, as if confirming she had heard me correctly. The shift in her demeanor made my stomach tighten. It was clear that I had touched on something she hadn't expected. She then told me the story of that mirror. Apparently, it had belonged to her grandmother. Long before the house was what it was now, her grandmother had worked as a nurse. She took in people who were dying, people who couldn't afford care in their final days. Instead of turning them away, she turned her home into a kind of hospice. People came there knowing they were at the end of their lives. They stayed in different rooms, cared for, until they passed. The room with the mirror was one of those rooms. According to my grandmother, strange things happened to the people who stayed in that room. Not everyone, but enough that stories began to circulate. One of the people was a kind, gentle old woman. She spoke about seeing and hearing a young lady come into her room at night. The young woman played a harp for her. The old woman described the music as beautiful and comforting. She was grateful for it and believed someone had been sent to soothe her in her final days. But no one knew who the young woman was. No one in the house owned a harp, and no one else ever heard music coming from that room. Another story involved a young boy who stayed there. He spoke about meeting an older boy who would come to play with him. He described the games in detail, insisting that this older boy really knew his games, like someone who had played them many times before. The boy was happy, excited even, and never seemed frightened. But no one ever saw the older boy he talked about. No visitors were recorded, and no one matched the description. Then there was the woman my grandmother described as terrible. She was difficult in every way. She refused to use the bathroom and instead relieved herself in a cooking pot, which she hid under her bed. She argued constantly, accused everyone of mistreating her, and caused problems daily. According to my grandmother, this woman saw something very different from the others. She claimed to see what she called the devil. She said it spat fire at her. She became so distressed and aggressive about it that the police were eventually called. She even tried to accuse the nurse of attempting to kill her by summoning the devil. No one could calm her down. As my grandmother told me all of this, the stories didn't sound exaggerated or theatrical. She told them like facts, like things that had simply happened and were now part of the house's history. She didn't try to scare me. She didn't dramatize anything. That somehow made it worse. She also mentioned that my mother had seen the same young lady who supposedly played the harp, though my mom didn't hear any music at the time. Just the presence of a young woman standing quietly. My grandfather, she said, had seen what the terrible woman described as the devil, but his description was different and far more detailed. He described a red man with horns. The figure was too tall for the room it appeared in. Instead of crouching, it stood upright and bent its neck downward to fit under the ceiling. The image alone was unsettling. But what stayed with me most was what the figure said. According to my grandfather, it stared down at him and spoke slowly, clearly, and calmly. It asked him a single question. Why are you here? Not angrily, not threateningly, just deliberately. as if the question itself carried weight. After hearing all of that, the mirror no longer felt like just an old object passed down through generations. It felt like something that had witnessed too much, something tied to moments of life, death, and whatever exists in between. I didn't argue, I didn't question it, I didn't try to be brave or curious anymore. I kept the mirror covered, every day, every night. I never uncovered it again while I was there. Some things, once you learn their history, are better left alone. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.